In this video, we talk about a simple 4-step process to journal your way to inner child healing. This is one of those things that I believe is very important and pretty much everybody should do. I have found it very helpful. I think you will as well. When we're doing inner child work, I find that a lot of the time we have a very emotional reaction because it feels very real. As we're unraveling these patterns and wounds, they feel very personal. The advantage of writing these things down is that you can see them reflected back at you and they're not all caught up in your head, and it has the power to depersonalize a lot of these things that feel very intense and real and scary and but when you see them on a piece of paper reflected back at you, it's a lot easier to look at it and think, oh, that's interesting. Do I really think that? Rather than being caught up in, oh my god, I can't do this. If you're not sure at all what the inner child is, then I have a video right here. But basically, the inner child is our kind of subconscious belief patterns about who we are and who we have to be that are often very limiting and are formed early in our life. These patterns that we form as little kids often pop up in adulthood as very emotional, irrational responses that don't make a lot of sense, but in the moment they are very hard to override because they cut through to the core beliefs we have about ourselves and the world. So often in adult life we have these child patterns, these things we learned about how we needed to be as a little kid to survive, whether that was realistic or not. Even if nothing bad actually happened to you as a little kid, you can end up with beliefs about how you need to be, or I'm not good at this, or I can't do that, or I'm this type of person. And then we come up against hard barriers in adult life that are no longer actually true, but they get filtered through that perspective we had as a little kid. And so they trigger those same emotional reactions as that little kid saying, I can't do that, I don't know, I'm scared, I want my mom. And when you are in your 40s, that's not particularly helpful. So what you want to do is grab a journal or even just a piece of paper, note-taking app on your phone, whatever it is, just make sure that it's something you will keep for a while and have the ability to go back in the future and look down at what you wrote now. And the very first thing you are going to do is think of whatever present challenge is occupying your mind. Whatever you've been the most worried about, maybe it's a historical thing you've had the most trouble with, a fear or an insecurity or some kind of challenge that you've had for a long time. Maybe it's whatever is presently on your mind. Write down, why is this challenging me? Or why is this difficult? Or why am I afraid of this? Give yourself permission to trust what comes up naturally as being the thing you should investigate. Don't stress too much about getting it right. In fact, if you find yourself stressing too much about getting it right, ask, why do I think that I have to do this right? Or why do I care so much that I get this one thing right? Because that in and of itself can be a symptom of one of these wounds. Now, there's that saying that if you want to get to the truth of something, you need to ask why just about 3 times. And that's what you're going to do here. So you might get a response of, well, because I'm insecure about this and I'm worried about this other thing, or maybe if something bad happens here, this other thing, or I'm afraid of that because of this. Ask, why that? And then another time, ask, well, why is it this? And the goal is we're trying to dig deeper and deeper into these kind of patterns that run our behavior, these things that determine our sort of if this then this logic patterns in our brain. So often in life we have these kind of flash, no, I'm not going to do that. Or we tell ourselves we want to do something. We might consciously want something, and then we find that part of us clearly doesn't want to because we simply don't do it. So the goal is to find those places in your brain where there's those sort of automatic triggers that are set up that are determining your behavior in life. And when you're doing this as a journaling exercise, just allow whatever comes up default to be your answer. Once again, don't stress too much about getting it right. Write out whatever comes to mind. So why am I struggling with this? Well, it's because of work and this other thing I'm dealing with here. Well, why is that challenging? As if you were having a conversation with a friend. Try to get to the bottom of the way this part of yourself, this part of your brain is thinking about the situation. And what our goal is with this first line of whys is to find a sort of hard no that doesn't make a lot of sense, an unexplained no, like a hard limit that your mind has on something. So for instance, for myself, if I say, well, why am I insecure about this thing that's coming up? Or why do I find it challenging would actually be the question. I would say, well, I'm insecure about these results, or I want to make sure I do it right. Well, why do you want to make sure you do it right? Well, if I don't do it right, then I'll let people down. Why don't you want to let people down? That, for me, can come up as a hard no. It's not that I actually have a response for why I don't want to let people down. That comes up initially as like a tight emotional feeling in my chest that says, oh boy, it's like a fear response. If I let somebody down, something bad will happen. It's not necessarily a logical answer. So what you're looking for in this first line of inquiry is when something comes up within you that triggers a sort of fear emotion. They're like, well, that can't happen. In a situation that doesn't maybe objectively make that much sense. Like, would actually letting somebody down be the end of the world? No. But it feels like a hard no. So when you get to the point where you have uncovered one of these hard limits that doesn't really have a logical answer, you just get to a place where your brain says, I can't let people down. I can't let people in, maybe. I can't trust people. I can't let that happen. What I find helpful is to investigate further and say, well, what happened the last time you let somebody down, in my case? Or what happened if you were to let somebody down? What would happen if this happened? And then investigate what that subconscious voice thinks would happen if you were to, in this case, let somebody down, or if you were to let somebody in, or if you were to have that thing you're afraid of happen. What is the consequence that this pattern of your subconscious mind thinks will follow? And the big benefit of doing this in a journaling format is that you have the ability to see how some of these things don't make sense even as they are simultaneously feeling like emotional triggers in yourself. You might feel kind of emotional, but also be able to read it on a page and say, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Until you have that view of yourself, these things are running on autopilot as code written into your brain that we assume is fundamentally true and make important life decisions on these emotional responses. Once we have that sort of separation to see them on paper, we can say, wow, is that actually what runs me when I'm not paying attention? And it very frequently is. And that in and of itself provides a lot of freedom. And when we're investigating this hard no, this you can't do that, that's a hard limit, this is off limits type voice that comes up when you're asking, well, why is this challenging? Why is it a threat to me? What happens if this? And you get that, no, this can't happen response. That's often going to be a piece of mental code that was written in there in an emotional moment in your childhood, where maybe you learned as a little kid that you needed to people please, and so your parents would feel okay so that you got your needs met. And now when it comes up to letting people down, you have the feeling that if I let people down, then they're gonna crumble and fall apart, and then I won't get my needs met and everything's gonna go wrong. That might not be a rational perspective anymore. Maybe it never was, but as an adult, it's probably not the most useful piece of code to have running your life as an automatic decision maker. So ask, what happens if I let somebody down? This is where we get into the core wounds, because that no voice is not actually a childhood wound. That no voice is a protector. That is our compensation mechanism. That no is how we protect ourselves from having to feel the pain we associate with our inner child wounds. So the core feeling, for my sense of like, you need to never let anybody down, well, what happens if you let somebody down? What would happen if that were true? And the voice says, you would be a failure, you would be abandoned, it's so bad perceived. It's so bad in that story, that pattern, that we can't even think about that. It brings up a fear reaction, like it would be so bad that we cannot let that happen. When you write that down, once again, it's kind of silly to think that, but it feels to that memory, that pattern that was formed in a very emotionally charged moment as probably a scared little kid sometime, it feels very real. It feels very scary. It feels like an overwhelming, this can never happen, we need to do everything to protect ourselves from this. The stories we frame these things as are what become the patterns we use in our day-to-day lives much later that might not serve us very well at all. In fact, they can be very negative and very limiting to our abilities as an adult trying to function in society with any kind of healthy view of self. So allow yourself to ask whatever questions come up when you hit one of those hard no's, and have a dialogue back and forth with yourself, ask a few more questions, and then I suggest ending with a question like this, or maybe not ending, but at least throwing in a question like, what would happen if I were allowed to let people down? Or what would happen if I were allowed to let people in? If I were allowed to trust? Or if I was allowed to have boundaries? What would happen if I was allowed for this limit to go away? Because that no voice, right, that protection voice, is very often what we find causes us to self-sabotage. We want to go achieve all these things in life, but we have a voice saying, well, you can't look stupid, you can't let people down, if you mess it up, you're going to be a failure, and you need to keep everybody happy. And those restrictions, those autopilot restrictions, those emotional fears, what if all this happens, end up being the more powerful force than our willpower, which is like, I want to do these things, but all this stuff drags us down. When you say to yourself, what would happen if I were allowed to fail? What would happen if I gave myself permission? You give that no voice, that automatic pattern, a chance to kind of relax a little bit. And what you realize is that there is a lot of energy and freedom behind those voices that are programmed long ago that still run our decision-making process. Those automatic assumptions we make about who we are and how we need to be. When you remove those, when you say, well, what if those voices were allowed to take a break? What if I was allowed to do those things you said I couldn't? In the absence of all of those limitations, there is a tremendous amount of freedom, a tremendous amount of energy. What if you could pour yourself 100% in without those limits? Because those limits, as you see them, might not make that much logical sense. And when we can see on a piece of paper that our perceived limitations, those stories, those hard no's, don't actually make that much sense, and we can ask ourselves, well, what if I were allowed to bypass that hard no? That frequently opens up a whole new avenue. You think, oh wow, what if I could just do those things? Investigate that hard no, because those hard no's are that protection, right? The hard no is to keep us saying, if this happens, my core wound, the things I believe about myself will be triggered, and I can't have that, so I need to compensate by making sure everybody likes me, or making sure I don't let people in because they could hurt me. Go beyond that to see, well, why is that? What part of me believes I'm not worthy? Is that true, firstly? Where does that come from? And then furthermore, what if I was allowed? What if I gave myself permission to transcend that limit? What if that voice got to take a break? What if that no voice that has been monitoring everything you've done for your entire life got to take the day off? Wouldn't that save you a lot of energy, a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety? That part of your brain that is constantly having to monitor. When we have those emotional reactions, it becomes a very big thing. We obsess over it. It takes a tremendous amount of energy. So asking, well, what if I were to be free? What if I were to let go of these things? And see what comes up. And you might find, of course, that those patterns are not ready to let go, and they might be very negative at first. You might have some very negative beliefs. And the whole purpose of viewing these things through the lens of a journaling system is to see them on paper reflected back and realize that those patterns in your brain do not very often at all reflect actual reality. So when you do this, when you journal and write these questions back and forth, when you have this dialogue with yourself, please do it. Just give it a try, and you will find that the beliefs your subconscious mind has, those inner child patterns, aren't very real. They're not very logical. They don't make a lot of sense, but so often this is what informs people's beliefs about, I'm worthless, I have no self-esteem, I can't do these things, I need to people please, I can't handle conflict. So many of our psychological limitations are based in these kinds of subconscious patterns about who we are. And to see them reflected back at you and see that that's not real, that's not very true. Like, that's a perspective I might have had 20 years ago as a little kid who had no agency in the world, but that is not something that needs to constrain my present reality. And that is the power of this journaling practice. I really hope you find it helpful. I have found it tremendously helpful. Have a dialogue with yourself. Get to know your inner child. There might be some emotion, there might be some crying, there might be some anger, but realize that those emotions were stored in the past. And by feeling them as an adult, you can actually start to kind of heal your way through these unresolved patterns that keep us, until we go through this process, they keep us bound to that past. We are constrained by those emotions. Only the perception, only that fear that, well, I'm not enough and I need to succeed so that people like me, and then if everybody likes me, then I get to be enough. When you see that on that piece of paper, you'll realize that's kind of dumb. And it's not really that big of a deal, and it doesn't need to limit you now. So go through this process, ask yourself these questions. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions on this video or any journaling prompts you have found useful in your own inner child work. If you want to know a little bit more about the inner child, I have a video about finding freedom through healing inner child up here, kind of going more in depth about specifically our psychological limitations, and I have a general video about all things inner child up here. Thank you so much for watching. We will see you next time.